Okay. So a few announcements. Many of you are signed up for the National Extension Conference on Volunteerism, which is virtual, and that's going to be next week. I hope that you've signed up for the Master Gardener Coordinator pre-conference session. We have some really great breakout sessions planned, and we'll be asking questions about hybrid learning and how do we keep volunteers engaged during COVID, which actually links in with Marisa's presentation today. So I hope that you have registered for the conference. I hope that you'll join us for the pre-conference. And the goal of the pre-conference too is to give coordinators an opportunity to meet each other and interact with one another, so we can learn a little bit more and also just meet fellow coordinators. In addition, our next Extension Master Gardener Coordinator discussion will be May 19th. We have a panel discussion that's going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, best practices, and the focus will be on engaging new audiences for our Extension Master Gardener programs. So I'd really appreciate it if everybody wants to join that one. We can learn about DEI updates. And after that one, we're going to do our first regional discussion. So Susan DeBleek is going to be coordinating for the North Central region, and we'll send out an announcement later this week from John Orrick about the upcoming webinar. So our first part of next month, we'll be talking about the DEI best practices with the panel. And then after that, we are asking for coordinators from the North Central region to stay on. We'd like to network, have some small group discussion, share ideas, issues, concerns, and Susan will introduce herself and help facilitate that discussion. After that, we have other regions planned later in the year, so we'll update you on that as well. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And today we have Marisa and Coyne joining us from California. Marisa is the statewide volunteer engagement coordinator for the University of California. And as you probably heard last month, Marisa in California did a great job with creating a survey on measuring volunteer.
Looks like you're muted, Nicole.
Thanks. So Marisa is going to expand on that today and talk to us about the project Prioritization Rubric and how they've applied that to programs in California. Marisa, are you ready?
Yes, thank you so much, Nicole. I'm going to begin
You're welcome.
Sharing my screen here. Okay, so hopefully what you're looking at right now is the first slide of the presentation, UC Master Gardener Program Project Prioritization Rubric. Great, I got the thumbs up from Nicole, so I'll take it from here. Nicole, thank you so much for providing me with this opportunity to speak with you all and learn with you all. I've been attending these Extension Master Gardener Program webinar series offerings for the last 2 years that I've been in my position as volunteer engagement coordinator with the University of California Master Gardener Program. I want to give a quick shout out to some of my statewide colleagues, Missy Gable, Lauren Snowden, who are on the call, as well as a few of our county coordinators from Santa Clara, Catherine Udi from Tulare and Kings, Aaliyah, and then Julie from our Sutter Yuba region. So thank you so much for being on the call today. This is kind of a part two from the presentation that Tamika Wilkins, our evaluation coordinator, and I provided last time, which discussed the statewide results and some recommendations related to COVID-19 and volunteerism. So today's presentation is going to be a little bit shorter, and this project is really an outcome of that COVID-19 and Volunteerism Survey. So we're going to have a little bit of time to review some material today, and then we're also going to have some time to work this rubric and think about how it might apply to your programs in your states and counties. So again, thank you for inviting me here today to provide this talk. Today's agenda, I'll do a little bit of background information on this project. We'll talk through some of the meeting logistics. We're going to have some practice with our rubric, and then we'll have some discussion and closing remarks. So it's a pretty loose agenda. Please feel free to drop your questions or comments into the chat. We'll try to monitor that as we go along. And Nicole, feel free to interrupt me if that drilling allows, and share any questions that you are seeing in the chat that you want to call attention to. Okay, so the project background, diminished volunteer commitment and staff capacity. So the why behind this project prioritization rubric, which is a tongue twister for sure. So let me share a little bit of the timeline on this project and say that when we set out to collect data about volunteer commitment in the COVID-19 era, we didn't actually know what that data was going to lead to, what sort of projects were going to emerge. But we had some ideas about collecting data to provide it to coordinators and then developing tools that might help our county level staff really administer programs in a time of diminished volunteer and potentially financial resources. So by way of timeline, in March 2020, Volunteer Match, which is a nationwide volunteer engagement organization that advises nonprofits and also extension volunteer coordinators, released some survey results. They released a second round of survey results in May of 2020, and everything that they were finding was pointing to diminished volunteer commitment on the order of about 50% for the COVID-19 era. And we're still very much in that COVID-19 era. And we know that we're going to see long-term impacts to volunteer commitment for as long as COVID-19 is having an impact locally and at a national level. So those survey results indicated that volunteer managers should really expect to be operating at a 50% capacity for the time being. In June of 2020, we introduced this concept to UC Master Gardener program personnel of distributing a survey to capture what volunteer commitment might look like in the Master Gardener program, which is a program that engages over 6,000 volunteers annually and provides garden and home horticulture information to thousands of Californians. So we thought that our results might be a little bit different. You know, we sort of have a membership model based organization, and some of the volunteer match data was looking at folks who were engaging in episodic volunteering or who were engaging in volunteering on a very time limited basis. And so we wanted to see if our results were going to stack up differently to those national results. In July, Tamika deployed the COVID-19 and Volunteerism Survey. And in 2020, we shared the statewide results with coordinators and county personnel and volunteers via our Brown Bag webinar series. We also distributed county level results so that folks could understand how their county level results might stack up against those statewide results. And finally, as an outcome, we developed this project prioritization rubric. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. And that was sort of an iterative process. So we wanted to help coordinators make decisions about how they were going to deploy limited resources. If you attended our webinar last time, you got to hear about the statewide survey results from our COVID-19 and Volunteerism Survey. And you can also view the webinars that we provided to our California personnel on our YouTube channel. We have both the COVID-19 and Volunteerism Survey as we introduced it, and then we also have a webinar that's discussing those survey results. And I'll share a little bit about what we found before I get into like the top line summary and the big takeaways for us in California. So we found that many of our volunteers were either not necessarily interested in committing to volunteering in the same way that they have done in the past during the COVID-19 era. We found that 36% of people really didn't know whether or not they were going to be able to make a commitment. And we found that 22% of people said that they were interested in volunteering both in person and online. But as you can see, the maximum percentage of volunteers who were saying they were either interested in volunteering online or volunteering in person was around 45%. So we found that we were pretty in line with those national data that were released by Volunteer Match. We were going to see a significant impact to our volunteer commitment through the COVID-19 era, which I'm interpreting to mean our 2020-2021 program year and our 2021 to 2022 program year. But we might see that that our years beyond 2022 are still being impacted. We also saw that volunteers were very concerned about the status of the program, but also even more so about specific projects and initiatives that they were involved in. So this was important for us in terms of messaging any changes in the program. Volunteers feel a very strong commitment to the Master Gardener program, but they also have a lot of identity wrapped up in the individual projects that they're involved in. So thinking about messaging in order to keep those volunteers excited and engaged is going to be really helpful. We released some recommendations to our county coordinators, and also we shared them on our webinar last time. So as we said, volunteers view their projects and activities as more vulnerable than the program. So we're suggesting using some kind of tentative language, perhaps when you're messaging about program changes. Of course, sometimes there's a case for really strong leadership. If there's a project that consumes a ton of volunteer resources and it doesn't produce that community impact, then maybe it's okay to be really clear and direct about why that project can't be a focus or what needs to change in order to bring it in line with some of our ambitious goals and ideas about what our programs can do. We also suggested that coordinators identify the virtual and in-person switch hitter volunteers. So these are volunteers that are going to be really good messengers because they are occupying two different spaces. They have indicated that they want to volunteer in person and they also want to volunteer online. So they're kind of your super volunteers for the time being. And they're going to be good people to communicate, to message to directly about any administrative or programmatic changes, because they're going to be able to reach those volunteers who are saying, hey, I only want to be online, or I only want to be in person. And finally, we heard that volunteers are really anxious to get back in the garden and back together. So thinking about those first, as state and local guidelines allow, of course, having those first meetings or gatherings, be really focused on stewarding that internal volunteer community, and that can be a really important volunteer retention strategy. But we also saw this thing that can't quickly or easily be fixed, which is the following. National and statewide data indicate that COVID-19 is going to significantly impact commitment in 2019, 2020, 2021. We saw that, and that it's potentially going to continue impacting volunteer commitment thereafter. So I'm thinking specifically about this upcoming program year, our 2021 to 2022. Our personnel are overwhelmed at UC-A&R, and I'm sure throughout cooperative extension. Personnel are needing to address new concerns. They're needing to implement a bunch of different new policies and practices to ensure the safety of volunteers and of themselves. And they're really stretched thin now that everything has moved online. Email volume has gone up, and folks are really needing to be strategic about how they're spending their time. And so we anticipate that personnel may need to limit the number of projects and initiatives, I kind of call it their project portfolio or their project load, until volunteer commitment can be restored. And that's just realistic, because if we have 50% of volunteers to deliver on 100% of our projects, that's not really possible. So how can we get creative and still keep our community impact high while also keeping our workloads somewhat reasonable? And coordinators indicated to us in the statewide office, like, hey, it might be useful to have a tool to help with this decision making, or help with coaching our volunteers and socializing this idea of limiting our project portfolio in the coming program years. And as our statewide lead, Glenda Humiston, often says, sometimes we need to do less with less, but we're not talking about less impact. We're talking about being really strategic about how we use our time and resources. And that includes how we deploy our volunteers. So we developed a project prioritization rubric, which I promise I'm going to share with you in just a second. You're going to get a PDF version of that in the chat. And we also are going to, hopefully in the future, it's going to be up on the EMG resources repository. So you'll be able to link to it and reference it as you need. And we anticipate that coordinators are going to use this rubric in a variety of different ways. Some coordinators may just want to understand how their current projects are aligning or stacking up with key UC Master Gardener program criteria, and substitute your own Master Gardener program or your own system into that line. So understanding how current projects are aligning. So that's sort of like a curious approach. Like, we're not necessarily saying that we're going to make any decisions with the information that we find, but we just want to understand how our current projects are stacking up. Some other coordinators may want to identify specific areas of improvement for all projects. So they're not necessarily looking to cut projects from their project portfolio. They just want to understand what areas are we kind of like weak or lacking in, or where do we need to build muscle. Next, we see some coordinators wanting to elevate and invest resources in projects that are really, really closely aligned with the Master Gardener program mission, core values, the strategic initiatives of our division, with local priorities, fundraising objectives. And this one's super important for me, the needs and assets of communities underinvested by extension. So that makes me think about the Black community, the Latinx community, Asian American Pacific Islander community, Native communities, LGBTQIA folks, and disabled folks. So really thinking about, are we being responsive to the needs and priorities of communities that haven't always received investments from cooperative extension? And finally, some people are really looking to straightforwardly from the outset reduce their project load by pausing projects. So there's that tentative language that are requiring significant improvement or investments for the next couple of program years, so that they can really focus on those projects that are delivering community impact in this time when the profile of gardening is really, really high. So how are we reaching people with good information right now in a way that's thoughtful about the resources that we're needing to expend? So let's talk through the project prioritization rubric criteria and the process that we used to develop this. And I'm going to ask Lauren if Lauren can drop a file into the chat. And this is a PDF version of the project prioritization rubric. Again, you're going to receive a PDF of this document in a follow-up email from today's webinar. And also we hope to have it in the resources repository so that we can link to it in an ongoing way. So it should show up here in the chat in another moment or so as we make our way through. And Lauren, Lauren or Nicole, feel free to interrupt me if it's not showing up there. So the rubric that we're going to be looking at, this is the current version of it. You can also take a screenshot here if you like, if you're having trouble accessing that document as it comes through the chat. So you can take a screenshot to refer to, knowing that a better, clearer, higher resolution version is going to be coming to you in your inbox. So you may want to take a screenshot of this one right here. And Lauren, I'm not seeing it in the chat quite yet. It might just be me.
It's not you, it's me.
Okay.
It's having me authorize some stuff and do some very, fancy, making sure that it's not, I don't know, spam?
Okay.
I'll give it a second. I'm almost there. We'll see.
Thank you so
I'll keep you
much.
posted.
So folks, for the time being, go ahead and take a screenshot of this slide and it's going to be coming to you. Don't worry, we're not going to be using it quite yet. So it's not an emergency if you don't have it in front of you right at this moment. But I do want to talk through each of those criteria in a little bit of detail. So as we're going through these criteria, think about what criteria you would consider including if you were to develop a rubric for your statewide program or for your county. So we have our mission statement, and our mission statement in California is to extend research-based knowledge and information on home horticulture, integrated pest management, and sustainable landscape practices to the residents of California, and to be guided by our core values and strategic initiatives. And one of our top core values is to utilize trained and certified volunteers at the county level. So be thinking about that. Like if a project doesn't score very high on mission and core values, then that's really a flag for us to be like, oh, let's call our attention to this project and really think about whether or not this is an optimal place for us to be investing our resources if it's not at this time a project that meets with our mission. So maybe it needs a little bit more workshopping, a little bit more thought in order to bring it in line with that mission and core values. That feels pretty baseline. We also have some strategic initiatives that we strive to work toward in the Master Gardener program in California. And we're proud to say that we're the only statewide program in California that works in each one of these strategic initiatives. So we provide education about pests. We do work that has implications for healthy families and communities. We think a lot about sustainable food systems and natural ecosystems, and also water quantity, quality, and security through the education that we provide for low water gardening, and also ensuring that runoff doesn't affect our watershed. Next, we have local priorities. Of course, this is a place where, sometimes counties can be really creative and responsive. So when I think about local priorities, I'm thinking about the local priorities of our cooperative extension offices. So where our advisors and county directors have real seats of strength. But I'm also thinking about our county leadership and our partner organizations and community-based organizations. So these are our school districts, our resource conservation districts, our crisis centers. You can think of a variety of different ones. So on this slide, I have our Marin Municipal Water District, which funds some of our programming in Marin County. We also have the Land Trust of Napa County, who provides some funding. We also have some land trust relationships in Sonoma County, which is represented by Land Paths. So there's a variety of different local community-based organizations that have missions that are aligned with the Master Gardener program, and we can amplify one another's program delivery by working closely together and aligning those priorities. And also, let's be realistic, some people have grant-funded positions where they have program funders and they need to be responsive to those program funders. So that's an important consideration for some of those projects. I think about our San Joaquin waste management department, which funds some of our positions. So we have to make sure that we're really thinking about composting and how we deal with compost education as part of our project portfolio. The second to last criteria is one that gets me really excited, which is unique areas of brilliance of our volunteers. And this can be a place I've had some conversations with coordinators, like, sometimes volunteers want to use their unique areas of brilliance to the exclusion of some of these other criteria. And I really see it as kind of part and parcel of what makes a good project. So my motivation, I study organizations and volunteerism, and it really is the case that if folks have self-interest in a project, they tend to work harder, they tend to work smarter, they tend to be more invested in the success of that project. So I think it is important to consider those unique areas of brilliance of our volunteers and of our staff. That's going to make for sustainable projects that are highly, highly impactful. So what you're looking at right now is some photos of some of our volunteers who were recently featured in our National Volunteer Week blog series, who have like amazing skills and they really leverage those skills in order to create projects and initiatives that are really, really highly impactful. So on the left, we have Caesar in Southern California and Riverside, and he's done a ton of work with leadership development for Latina youth in Riverside. And also he's a community educator who has some really amazing connections and tech expertise. So he's really leveraged his unique areas of brilliance for community impact. In the center at the bottom, that's Elizabeth. And she's also an amazing volunteer in Southern California, a community educator, a business owner, and has leveraged some of her skills to make great community impact. Above her is Jennifer Coyne, who is in LA, who's fluent in Mandarin and also speaks Cantonese and reads Cantonese and has done a ton of outreach with Mandarin and Cantonese speaking folks in the LA area. So volunteers who are using their unique skills to improve our program outreach. And that is a criteria that we want to think about and include. And we hope that you'll read the UC Master Gardener program blog for more stories about these wonderful volunteers. And finally, communities underinvested by extension. So we have a couple great examples that are also on our blog, our Search for Excellence winners at the statewide level. So we have on the left-hand side, a collaboration in San Diego with Alzheimer's San Diego doing memory gardening with folks who are residing in a memory care facility. And then on the right-hand side, folks who are working in rehabilitation facilities or who are struggling with drug and alcohol addiction, who participate in gardening as a means of gaining the therapeutic benefits of a horticulture practice. So these are two projects that really focus on the needs and priorities of communities that are often underinvested by extension. And we really love to see that within our Master Gardener program in California. Finally, I said I was going to talk about the process here. So we didn't just generate this project prioritization rubric and then turn it over to our partners in the county. We wanted to make this sort of a responsive process. So we solicited feedback on the rubric in September of 2020. We added some criteria for fundraising events. So not every event is a fundraising event, but of course, thinking about the impact of a fundraising event can be helpful. And so we have that as an optional criteria, as you'll see on the rubric. We also had a couple of in-depth conversations with our amazing county director, Dustin Blakey in Inyo Mono, and our wonderful program coordinator in Santa Barbara, Danica Tabor, who helped me workshop and generate some of the scenarios that you all are going to see today that hopefully help get a sense of how the rubric can work for you. And we also developed some instructions to accompany the rubric. And the scenarios were developed for training purposes. So with that, I'm going to lead into the practice session, but I just want to do a quick check-in and see if we were able to drop the project prioritization rubric into the chat. Were we successful with that?
I feel so bad. For some reason, I cannot get it to go.
Oh, it's not you, Lauren. Don't you stress about it.
A co-host, like we're working in the back trying to best we can. Like I see it, it won't go in. It's
okay.
Right there. I was thinking I could post them online real quick and then put a link for people to pull down. Do you think that would be a good solution?
Yeah, we have it on a hidden page on the coordinator site. So I wonder if we could link.
I can pull I can work something up in about 2 minutes.
Okay. Okay. And no stress, as I mentioned, we're going to be able to get these to you, and you'll also hopefully be able to access them in the resource repository on the EMG website. But let's talk through what this could look like. So in a moment, we do want to try to drop that PDF into the chat box, but we're going to see how we go. If we can't do that, we also have an option for you to pull up a digital version of the rubric. And what that's going to let you do is see each of the rubric criteria and actually enter your own results on each one of these scenarios. So you'll be able to enter your results, and you'll receive an email after you submit that survey form, and that's going to have all of the answers that you put in. There's no right or wrong answer. Again, like a rubric is not a fully objective tool, but what we hope is that together with maybe your coordinator peers, or perhaps you decide to assemble a group of volunteers to assist with this process, you'll be able to come up with those projects that need some more investment, or in those projects that are already really excelling. So I'm going to pull up this digital rubric, and I'll drop it into the chat so that you can take a look at this digital sample.
Hi, Marissa. I put a link to the PDF version just above the sample one you put in. So if anyone wants to look at that, it's there.
Cool. So you now have two options. You have the PDF, and then you also have a sample digital rubric in the chat. So everyone should be able to have access to them at this point. And what we're going to do is take now a 10-minute break. We're going to pause the recording, and we'll meet back here at 11:40. And your task will be to go through a couple of the scenarios that we've provided to you. And I'm going to give you a little preview here really quickly. And I'll also ask Lauren if you can load the instructions as well as the scenarios. That would be wonderful. But we have a few project scenarios, and we're going to ask you to apply the rubric to those scenarios. So decide, does this appear to match with the mission? Does this appear to match with the core values? Does this serve a community that's underinvested by extension in a way that involves members of that community and is thoughtful about the priorities that they've determined? And again, there's no right or wrong. You're just getting practice using this tool. And then we're going to come back together and discuss, do these project scenarios seem familiar? Do the criteria of the rubric, are they difficult to assess? Which one was most difficult to assess? And how do you imagine using this tool or a similar one in your own program? And for purposes of ease, I'm going to leave one of our scenarios, so at least everyone will have a chance to assess Project Alpha up on the screen during our break. And we'll work on getting that list of scenarios to you in the chat. And Lauren's just put a list of instructions there if you want to see the instructions that we disseminated to coordinators to give them a sense of what the intention of the rubric was and how they might use it. So let's take 10 minutes here. We'll meet back at 11:40, and we can discuss the results of this effort.
Sounds good.
And with that, we've had 10 minutes to kind of look at some of these project scenarios. And my question to you in the chat, or you can feel free to unmute yourself and share, is do these projects seem familiar? So let's start with that. Yes or no, do these projects seem familiar to you? And I should note that these were sourced from coordinators themselves. And when I mentioned earlier that Dustin and Danica worked with me to refine the rubric, they shared some projects in their county that felt familiar to them and that they thought could kind of translate to counties throughout California. So are these project scenarios familiar to you? Let us know in the chat.
I'm seeing yes. The first one was familiar because it was an example project that had been done for many years, but it probably hadn't been revisited in a while as to why we were doing it or things that could be improved. But it was very dear to the volunteers, maybe needs to work on the ROI a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. This is the garden tour. I think Lauren mentioned as well. So Stephanie and Lauren are like, yep, that one is familiar to us too. So go ahead if you haven't yet entered whether or not these projects, and it doesn't just have to be Project Alpha, it can be any of the projects that you looked at if they're familiar to you. So yeah, this is a project that's very dear to volunteers, but there's a question of whether or not it's actually meeting the objectives that are laid out by the program. And yeah, that's exactly what our coordinators found when they used this rubric to assess the project. They found that this project had an overall score of 9 and that it needed improvement. So again, this is not an objective scenario key. I have a key that I'll be able to share with you. That's just what the coordinators in California came up with. You may come up with some different scores when you work the rubric in your county or with your own projects, but they did indicate that this needed improvement and that it could show a little bit more alignment with the core values, with the mission of the program, and also with the strategic initiatives. Now, there is something to be said for those projects that are really powerful for stewarding and maintaining your community of volunteers. I think it's totally fine to have a project that really serves a need for the internal community and doesn't necessarily check all of the boxes in terms of our outreach and our impact in our broader community. However, this tool, we hope, is going to help us be honest with ourselves. If we have 10 projects and 5 of them are really stewarding and meeting the needs of the internal community of volunteers, then maybe we need to shift that a little bit more. But of course, there has to be space within our program. That's our volunteer retention strategy, is providing volunteers with a chance to socialize, a chance to share with one another. So some folks are indicating that, yep, several of them are familiar, but this is one that could show a little bit of improvement. The other question that we asked was which criteria that was listed is the most difficult for you to assess. So let us know in the chat there, or feel free to unmute yourself if there was a criteria that felt really challenging to assess.
Could you explain the unique area of volunteer coordinator brilliance?
Yeah, I think this one is a bit challenging. So I think the definition that we're trying to use is, does it showcase unique skills, and does it have an opportunity to impact the program at a statewide level, or maybe even involve some best practices that could impact the program at a national level. So looking for creativity, you can use a lot of different phrases. Sometimes I like to move away from innovation, but that might be a term that you kind of substitute there. Is there a project that shows some real creativity, some real innovation, some real uniqueness, some real brilliance on the part of volunteers or coordinators? So is it doing something that's quite novel and special in the way that it approaches the mission delivery? So that one is a little bit difficult to define, and I could certainly share some articles with folks if you're interested in thinking about that more. I saw that Sharon said the partnership goals criteria. Yes, that's really hard. That's something that I heard from Dustin. He said this is one of those places in our program where we can really see mission drift, where we start trying to meet the goals and objectives of our partner organizations and sort of lose ourselves in the process. So I think you're right, Sharon, that is a bit challenging. Let's take a look at Project Bravo here. And if anyone did Project Bravo, go ahead and just drop into the chat what your analysis looked like for this project. So this was a food gardening education project located in a demonstration garden. So if you assessed this one, let us know what you thought it scored well on, or any impressions of this project. Does it seem familiar to you? Do you recognize this project in your own county or state? Thanks, Catherine. So Catherine and Kim said, looked great to me. Opportunities for volunteer and community, gave it high scores except for in terms of innovation or unique areas of brilliance. Yeah, that feels right. And that's exactly what the Master Gardener coordinators in California said when I shared this project with them. They said it's a totally acceptable project, like on the high end of acceptable. And yeah, it doesn't perhaps excel in any one of these areas. And I know that many of us in the Master Gardener program are overachievers. They're like, we want excellent projects, but an acceptable project is a great project. That's a project that meets all of the criteria. And in fact, it more than meets them. it exceeds some of them. Nicole, I'd like that you mentioned it includes underinvested communities, it's bilingual, it's linked with a local nonprofit. Yes, Lauren says scored high for me too. It ticked all the boxes, it met the needs of the community. So again, the score that I'm sharing is just the norm of what some of our coordinators in California shared. So it's perfectly acceptable if you came up with a score that deviates from that one. So I think rather than moving through each one of these project scenarios, I want to drop the key for you into the chat. And again, as I mentioned, this is not going to, actually, maybe I'll ask Lauren to do that. If Lauren could drop the scenarios key. This doesn't mean that these are the definitive scores for each one of these projects. This is just what the coordinators in California came up with. And I'm sharing it with you so that if you decide to develop a similar tool in your counties or in your state, you have all of the resources that we developed in California. But I do want to go back to that question of, do you see yourself using this or something similar to this? What questions or ideas or suggestions do you have if you're thinking about creating something similar for your counties? And I'll stop my share and we can just have this last couple of minutes be focused on discussion in the chat, or you can feel free to unmute yourself.
I could see this being used in a few different ways. And I'll give an example. When I first started as an Extension Master Gardener Coordinator, I had a group of folks, volunteers, who approached me about creating a local award, and they didn't have any criteria. So I think that they wanted to create a committee to, I know this sounds bad, but give themselves awards. But we have state awards, we have national awards. So I actually could see doing this also like in an award format that you could share with volunteers. And I also could see using this template as a starting point to figure out what your local needs and mission are. And then when you as a coordinator are approached by volunteers with project ideas, sometimes we know everything that we have going on at the same time, or something's not in our plan of work for that year. This would be a good tool to share with them. So it becomes more objective, and it's not, people don't think, wow, you're just not accepting my idea or something like that. Like, I think it could be a really great just tool to help figure things out, and also get volunteers thinking about all the things that coordinators must consider when we take on projects.
That's really interesting, Nicole, and I think Leanne as well from Oregon both mentioned this idea of using it when we're thinking about developing new projects. So sort of asking those questions of ourselves and trying to get really honest about, like, okay, does this actually tick all of the boxes that we need it to tick in order for us to take this on? And yeah, you both kind of mentioned, I've used the term like objectivity halo. One of my coordinators was saying, can I change this project prioritization rubric? And I said, well, of course, I'd be happy to share with you a Word document version, but then we had a conversation about, like, is that something that you really want to do? Like, this was developed with input from coordinators and volunteer leaders across the state. And it does include all of those bits of feedback or all of those considerations. And so do you want to begin customizing it for your county and lose the strength that you have of saying, this is a tool that was developed by coordinators across the state, and so these really are our criteria. Of course, at your state level or at your county level, you may have different needs or ideas, but I do think there's something helpful about having a set of explicit criteria that's transparent to all, rather than, as Leanne mentioned, simply saying we can't do this project anymore, and providing little reason, or maybe it feels like it's a space where inconsistency can show up, or there can be a perception of bias on the part of the volunteer. So yeah, thanks for raising that suggestion. I also want to mention briefly that I had a conversation with a coordinator the other day about whether or not it could be possible to include like adaptability for online delivery in the rubric. And I just want to share that I intentionally did not include that in the rubric. And here's the reason, because this year we've seen so much interesting creativity and care put in on the part of coordinators and volunteers themselves to transition in-person programs to online program delivery. And I think if we were to evaluate projects at the outset based on our assumptions about what would make a decent online program, we may lose out on opportunities to deliver really, really cool and interesting projects. So I'll give an example. In LA County, There is a weekly program that's streamed on social media and also posted to YouTube that's called Garden in Place. And it's a really wonderful, informal, but really thoughtful presentation by volunteers. And this was just sort of meant to be a way to simulate like kind of drop-in garden office hours that so many of our master gardeners perform. And that's a project that feels very place-based and very dependent upon having gardening tools in one's hand and being able to, show and demonstrate tasks or illustrate features of a garden. And these volunteers just decided, you know what, I think we can actually do this in a successful way online. And because they didn't sort of limit themselves to those projects that already seemed like they made perfect sense to move online, they were able to get really creative and do something special. So I intentionally didn't include that online, virtual, remote feasibility, because I think that if we assess projects and we have really top projects, we're going to find a way to preserve some of those elements when we deliver them online. That's my 2 cents, but feel free to share your ideas or your dissent in the chat as well.
Hey, it's Lauren. Not only am I an employee, but I'm also a volunteer, and I come from a small county with a small volunteer base compared to a lot of other counties in Northern California. And sometimes when we have a project, like this rubric comes to my mind, because I think that if some of our volunteers saw the rubric and were like, oh, we don't excel here, like this also to me jars that in my head that we have so much room to improve some of our projects that we love the most. And just looking at this the first time when Marisa gave it to me for review, I initially started putting certain projects that I volunteer in through it and was like, oh, we could do better. Oh, we could contact people. We could, do other things. Oh, we could reach out this way. So it's interesting even just to look at it once and then know that later on down the road when I'm doing a project, it's popping into my head as something that I'm keeping in mind. And as a professional, I usually keep my mission of my program in my mind, but as a volunteer, this rubric really helped me because I'm not necessarily always connected to the mission of whatever I'm doing as a volunteer. But this rubric, I think, helped me as a volunteer really like, oh, we could do better here. Oh, we don't go to that side of our county. Oh, we don't go into that zip code. We're a dual county program, so we have a wider space to cover. So it kind of helped me see that we could do better and offer our program a little more widely or multiple times. So even if the rubric isn't used to make new projects or review something that goes away, it is going to help improve, if you have a group that needs direction, I think.
Thanks for that, Lauren. Yeah. We have a few minutes left, so if there are any other comments or questions, feel free to share, and I'll leave it open for a moment or so, and then after that, I think we'll be ready to turn it over to you, Nicole, to take us out.
Marisa, this is Julie Bowen up in Sutter, Yuba, and I agree 100% with Lauren on what she stated. And me being a new coordinator, it helps also with Lauren's expertise, and this rubric to me is like what we need, a tool, something in our toolkit that we really need as an organization.
I'm glad to hear that, Julie. Yeah, and I'll be sure to share. We have a link to this on the UC Master Gardener Program Coordinator site, so I'll be sure to share that with you, so you'll have access to everything that we showcased here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julie.
I was just going to share an approach too. So sometimes, launching a rubric similar to this statewide or even with all of your volunteer programs could be a big goal and a big plan. So sometimes it might be helpful if you have an advisory committee or an executive leadership team or a group that you work with to start evaluating a few projects as opposed to everything, using the rubric, and then perhaps getting the advisory committee members or your leadership team on board to help facilitate this. That might be a great way to kind of do an approach that is accepted by folks and kind of feels like they have time and part of the decision-making process.
That's a great point, Nicole. Yeah, thinking about how you socialize the rubric is going to be really helpful, and deciding how you're going to approach it. Are we just getting curious about what's out there, or are we actually looking to kind of pause or sunset a couple of projects? I think I recommend the former approach, getting curious and really thinking about and having these discussions with, whether it's with lead volunteers or with an advisory council, and thinking carefully about how our activities and practices align with our mission. Hopefully that's a normal conversation that we're having in our counties, but with everything else that's going on, particularly over the last year and a half or so, it's really, it can be challenging to have those conversations. And so we just hope that this tool is useful in starting them. But I agree, being thoughtful about the approach is going to be very critical to the success of this project or effort. And I think with that, I'll just say thank you to you, Nicole, for inviting me back for a second presentation. And thank you to the rest of the Extension Master Gardener Network and community. And we hope to see you next week at the National Extension Conference on Volunteerism. Tamika and myself will be presenting many versions of the two presentations that you've seen over the last couple of months at NECV this year. And be sure to order, if you haven't already, your 5 languages of appreciation in the workplace. The keynote talk is going to focus on this text, but applying it to managing and engaging volunteers. So I'm really looking forward to that. And we'll see you all online in Oklahoma.
All right, well, we'll see you all next week for the conference, and then May 19th, we're kind of going to segue into diversity, equity, and inclusion and best practices. So be sure to join us for that. And Marisa and Lauren, thank you so much for your help today. I'm getting lots of private messages of people asking for resources. So I'll reach out to you, Marisa, after the presentation about that. And thank you all for your time. If you have more questions or comments, you can follow up with Marisa. And I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you. Thank you, Lauren.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.